Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Return to Office Policies, Key Employer Considerations. Whether you are team remote work, hybrid, or return to office, it's important for employers to know what their options and pitfalls are with respect to returning employees back to the workplace and how to best quell some of that pushback. Before getting further into today's topic, I would like to take a moment to introduce myself and my organization, complianceHR. My name is Stephanie Zielinski, and I'm the Marketing Director. You may recognize my name from the invitation emails you received for today's event. And some of you may have even emailed me directly about this presentation. To prevent a few popular questions from entering the Q&A box today, I'd like to let you all know this presentation is recorded and it will be emailed to each of you. So please keep an eye on your inbox for an email from complianceHR webinars. Now, a bit about complianceHR for anyone who may be unfamiliar. complianceHR is a joint venture between two incredible and innovative organizations, the AI technology company Neota and the law firm Littler Mendelson. complianceHR delivers expert employment law guidance in a fraction of the time you'd spend otherwise with traditional methods. Our goal is to simplify the complexity of employment law, something we will learn a lot about during this presentation. To achieve that goal, complianceHR offers a suite of technology solutions around critical HR compliance topics, like employee handbooks, employee overtime, independent contractor classification, onboarding, leave, and many others. Today, I would like to briefly introduce you to our two most popular solutions, PolicySmart and the Reference Center. PolicySmart is a comprehensive employee handbook solution that provides you with federal and state compliant templates, a compliance policy timeline, handbook checklists, and even sends automated alerts to let you know when legal changes are going into effect across the U.S. The Reference Center is a solution that combines key employment law and HR compliance topics, such as final pay, workplace posters, FMLA, minimum wage, predictive scheduling, and so many others. It was created to help HR, legal, and compliance professionals do their jobs more efficiently and effectively. This solution leverages data directly sourced from Littler to ensure compliant answers to your critical questions. If you're interested in learning more, a survey should have popped up on your screen, though you may have to exit full screen mode to see it. If you'd like to receive a demonstration of the Navigator Suite tailored to your organization's concerns and risks, simply answer yes, and I will send your contact information to our team of experts. In addition to a demo of our solutions, you may be eligible to receive a free trial of our products so you can see precisely how much time and money they will save you. Now, I have the pleasure of announcing today's expert presenter, Paul Cirner, a Littler associate out of Portland who focuses on all legal aspects of the employer-employee relationship and the author of the Dear Littler article on today's webinar topic. Paul, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. I'm really excited to talk to everyone today about this topic. I think it's obviously been in the headlines and something that people are considering with the future of work since the pandemic. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm an associate in the Portland, Oregon office. I kind of started working with remote work during the pandemic, and it's evolved significantly since then. And now we're starting to see more and more return to office. So I hope today's presentation will help you understand the pitfalls to avoid and the goals to accomplish and what methods you can use for your organization, whether you're considering a full return, a hybrid, or maybe even a little more remote work. So let's get started. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to start out talking about the return to office options. So what options are available to your organization? And it really is, as you'll see, going to be a choose your adventure. There'll be full return, hybrid, or some other alternatives that we'll talk about in more detail. Next, we'll talk about how to go about drafting a return to office policy and announcing your return to office, hopefully to avoid as much pushback as possible, which is going to be inevitable when you have employees who want to work remotely. But we'll give you some tips on how to go about doing that and what to think about. And then we'll talk about tracking and enforcement. Your policy and your announcement is no good if you're not intending to enforce it. So what are the ways to track employee compliance and their in-person attendance and how to enforce it? We'll talk about all the various avenues you can use, as well as some data privacy law concerns to think about. And lastly, we'll talk about the many legal pitfalls to avoid when you're doing a return to office. The most obvious that comes to mind, I'm sure many of you have already dealt with this, is you'll see a surge in remote work accommodation requests for disabilities or people who claim they have disabilities. The other interesting two avenues to be aware of are union issues with mandatory bargaining that might come into play, as well as protected concerted activity for the opposition that you might face. And lastly, we'll delve into quasi-contract and contract claims. This is, to be wary of any promises you've made to employees about their ability to work remotely and how to avoid claims in that area. And then lastly, we'll talk about compensable travel time, which is a question I often get for employees who are having to commute back to the office, whether that time is compensable or not. So what are the considerations you should take in forming your return to office plan or policy? I wanted to start out this presentation with a couple of surveys to really give you a lay of the land and what other organizations and employers are seeing and dealing with in this area. So this survey you see on your screen here is from a Littler survey from Q1 of 2024, where we polled about 402 professionals throughout the United States in HR, C-suite, and legal roles with their businesses. As you'll see from the chart, hybrid work seems to be the prevalent model right now for most organizations. There's been a slight uptick in fully in-person work, and fully remote appears to be the least common. But the majority of employers are in this happy medium of hybrid, which I think a lot of people are falling under. And as I said, this was Q1 of 2024. Since then, we've seen an uptick in return to office, even fully in person. And we'll talk about what that's going to look like in the future based on some information that we're getting from various sources and surveys. So when we think about the future of return to office, this is a fascinating survey that was recently conducted by KPMG as recently as August of 2024. And they polled more than 1,300 CEOs at large companies throughout the world, including 400 in the United States. Almost 80% of CEOs reported that in the next 3 years, they see their work environment being fully in office, which I think is a significant uptick from where things have been in the past few years. And only 17% felt that their workplace would be hybrid, and a mere 4% thought fully remote. And what's interesting about this survey is it really goes across many sectors. There's 11 sectors that were polled that could be automotive, banking, consumer retail, energy, IT, manufacturing, life sciences, and insurance. So it really does run the gambit. And we're starting to see that more and more businesses want their employees back in the office, and less are willing to go fully remote for various reasons. And I think over the next few years, we'll probably see a reduction in hybrid work arrangements as well. But a lot of this depends on your business and what's best for you and your employees, as well as your ability to retain and attract talent. So it all depends on what you're facing in your organization. And it can really vary between municipalities and universities, nonprofits and private sector. So there is no one size fits all approach. So what are some of the reasons that employers are considering a return to office? And many of you are probably considering these same factors yourself. This is a survey that SHRM conducted recently with over 1,500 HR professionals. And the overwhelming reason that employers are seeking a return to office is a need for in-person collaboration and teamwork, as well as to bolster workplace culture and employee engagement. Obviously, some of this is going to just be drawn solely from leadership preferences, although I think that category is kind of a misnomer because I bet if you were to ask those leaders why that's their preference, they would probably cite to teamwork, collaboration, or some other need. And then a few other reasons there. Obviously, productivity. Sometimes you'll see that remote workers are not performing as well as others, but that can also be a misnomer if you aren't tracking their performance, or you don't have a good way to see how they're performing. So when you make your decision, these are some of the factors that are going to come into play. It might also be that you have customer-facing positions or a need for that you didn't have during the pandemic. So the factors can vary, but you do want to kind of consider what your organization needs and what data or reason is behind the change. And that'll help you formulate how you want to do your return to office. Now, why are some employees against return to office? This is a survey that was conducted a little while ago, February 2023, but I think the truths from this survey still hold today. And most employees want to work remotely for the obvious reason that they can balance their work and personal life. This is especially true for working parents who want to have flexibility or who want to avoid a commute to the office. So as you can see, most employees felt that working remotely helps them balance their personal life with work and their ability to get work done or meet deadlines if they don't have to commute to the office or spend time chit-chatting, or maybe they feel like there's one too many in-person meetings that prevent them from getting their work done. What I think is very telling about this survey is that very few employees felt that working remotely improved their ability to grow in their careers, or their ability to get mentored, or ability to get important job assignments. And I think this rings true for some of the reasons why employers want people back in the office, is because a lot of times, depending on the position and the sector, there's going to be a need for some sort of mentorship with a senior leader or somebody more experienced, or some collaboration. And it can be a lot more organic to have those opportunities and assignments come your way if you're in the office and you're bumping shoulders with the people that are down the hall, as opposed to having to set up a Teams call or shoot an email over. So I think this data is really helpful because it shows that, kind of the tug and pull between employers and employees, and some of the things that they consider, and why some employees are just so opposed to returning to the office, especially when you have those family considerations. That can be understanding. But we'll talk about ways to tackle that pushback going forward. So return to office considerations. The first few questions you're going to want to ask yourself are, what type of return to office protocol best suits our needs? And this might require an assessment of your industry or your department heads, meeting with your key managers to figure out what the needs are for that department. I think it's also going to require you to consider who your top performers are and who you can and can't afford to lose through attrition, because some employees are going to refuse to come back to the office and find another job. That is just a necessary part of doing business. So if you have a department that has really strong revenue and really strong performers, that might be something that you consider in doing your return to office, to allow them to work hybrid, because you don't want to lose those people. And you can certainly tailor your approach based on what your business or your organization needs. Here in Oregon, I host an executive leaders session with a local SHRM chapter. And it's been really helpful because we have HR directors from, municipalities, universities, nonprofit, and the private sector, all talking about what they do at their organizations. And when you have that crossover, you can learn a lot from your peers in other sectors. So if you're starting to think about return to office and you're struggling with how to go about doing this, I would encourage you to attend some industry groups to learn from other people, especially when you have those different sectors. You'd be amazed at what people do at universities versus a private corporation, and the overlap that you could find. So that can be a really helpful resource as you're trying to tailor your approach. And as I said, should the expectations vary depending on the department or position? I think that at times they should, and that's okay, especially when you are worried about attrition. And also when you're considering whether it really is an essential function to come back to the office. Maybe you've got a certain team of individuals who work on projects, or a department that's doing very well working remotely. And it might be in the company's interest to allow them to continue doing that, or to give them a few remote days a week rather than a full return. So you can tailor it by department, you can tailor it by position. You could also do a full return for everyone if that fits your business needs. A uniform approach like that might make sense for you depending on what you're dealing with. And the last question to ask yourself is, how much opposition will you face? and how much opposition can you tolerate? I think, on a sliding scale, if you're doing a full return back in the office 5 days a week, that's going to be the highest opposition. Hybrid, you're going to get some pushback, obviously, but if you're doing a full return, I would expect to get a lot of opposition and to be ready to tackle that. So maybe you don't have the resources in your HR department to handle all the questions that are going to come your way, or the amount of employees that are going to be leaving to go work with your competitors. So you should also think about all these things in formulating your policy. And again, no one size fits all approach applies to return to office. Another thing to consider is whether you have the office space to support a return to office. Many of you have probably downsized your office space since the pandemic to save costs, or maybe some of you still have a lot of office space and you need to fill that. So that's something to think about, is whether you actually have the facilities to seat all these people that are going to be coming back to the office, or new talent you're going to be looking to hire to fill those cubicles and those offices. So what are the types of return to office that you can implement? As I mentioned earlier, there's the traditional full return, 5 days per week back in the office, which clearly has made headlines for various organizations and a lot of pushback and opposition to that, especially in the technology sector where people are used to working remotely. Then there is the hybrid return, which again, I think is a happy medium. And that can be a number of days per week or a number of days per pay period. It could also be just a number of weeks per year. And I think one thing to consider with the hybrid is if the goal of return to office is to increase collaboration and mentoring, I recommend that the employer chooses the days that the employees come back to the office, rather than just saying you have to be in the office 3 days a week. Because what ends up happening oftentimes is, an employee will come to the office and nobody else will be there because it's their remote work day, or there'll only be half the team there. And then you miss out on that collaboration or that mentorship that you were hoping to gain by making people come back to the office. So it might be better for you to say, this department needs to come back on Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays. Then everyone is there those days, ideally, and you get the most, bang for your buck of people being in the office. A lot of times we see pushback when employees are in a hybrid model and the employer is telling them it's going to help with collaboration and mentorship, but then they show up to the office and no one else is there and they feel really undervalued. And I think those are the scenarios where you're going to have more attrition, more people looking to go elsewhere. But if you can tailor it and pick the days that people are coming back, you have a little more control over the environment and the culture and making sure that people are actually there to engage with each other. So the full return to office is again, your biggest pushback, probably the largest amount of employees that you're going to see leave the organization, depending on your sector. But again, this might be necessary for your business. And it might also be a good way to kind of do a soft layoff. I think there are certainly some organizations that are using return to office to deal with an excess number of employees because some people are going to leave. I do take issue with criticism of people saying, well, everyone's doing return to office just to cut down their staff. Because in reality, a layoff is a much better way to go about doing that for an employer, because then they're selecting who's staying and who's going. And if you're just relying on return to office to get rid of some employees, you're not engaged in that selection process, and you are probably going to lose some pretty good talent or some important roles. So I would be mindful of that if you're intending to use return to office as a sort of soft layoff, is that you won't be having a say in who stays and who goes. Just going back to the hybrid model, for the number of weeks per year, I think this is a good solution to organizations that have remote workers in different states and that have, certain projects or deadlines that are quarterly or come around, every couple of months. So for example, if you have a big conference coming up in March of every year, It might be that the 3 weeks that people have to come back to the office are leading up to that conference in February to help prepare for it, to make sure everyone's in the office and engaging with each other, but then allowing remote work outside of that time period. So you really can tailor this to what your business needs. And as long as you're putting that in your policy and making clear what the expectations are, you as the employer have full control over how this works and how this looks. And that's also true for the last bullet point when it comes to the department or the position or the tenure specific return to office. I was at a conference recently and somebody in HR at their department told me they've had a lot of success with offering remote work as a benefit. And so what I mean by that is, we're going to do a return to office, but for new hires, you're going to have to complete, 6 or 8 months of satisfactory performance before you're eligible for hybrid work 3 days a week. And that's kind of nice because then you've got people coming in who know they're probably going to get that benefit down the road. And for the employer, it's helpful because you know that you've got those new hires in the office for at least 6 or 8 months, really soaking up the knowledge about the organization and hopefully being in person with other mentors and senior leaders during that very important first couple months of employment. So again, you can really tailor this to your organizational needs. So let's talk about the policy and announcement. If you're going to do return to office, it's ideal to have a written policy. And the reason for that is because you want to enforce the policy so that employees feel like they're being handled equally. They don't feel like they're coming back to the office and their colleague isn't showing up or they're coffee badging in and they're not getting disciplined for it. And they feel like they're making a big sacrifice to commute into the office and not be around their family as often, but it's not being equally handled. It also sets clear expectations with employees. So I recommend adopting a written remote return to office policy. And the policy should have a few categories in there. The first is you want to clearly explain what the expectations are. And so if you're going to do a full return, it should clearly state we expect you in the office 5 days a week. Or if you're going to do hybrid or position or department specific, you should spell out what the requirements are for each group of employees so that they know what they are and that you can hold them to account. The other thing you should do is identify what I call enforcers to the policy, and that's essentially who's going to be responsible for monitoring compliance with the policy or for receiving reports of noncompliance or attendance violations. And typically, it's going to be managers or human resources professionals. Your policy is also going to want to explain the disciplinary consequences for the failure to comply. Typically, most employers are going to do a progressive discipline for violations of return to office. Some employers want to take a more harsh approach or a more stern approach and really do a termination if you're not back on day one. But it all depends on what you're willing to tolerate and how you're willing to treat your employees. The last thing that you want to do in your return to office policy is reference your accommodation policy or process, because there are going to be probably some employees that are on an approved ADA accommodation to work from home, and you don't want to revoke that automatically because that could be a violation of the ADA. The other reason is that you want to let employees who have a physical or mental disability know that we are considering accommodation requests, and here is the policy for how to go about requesting that. This ensures that you're not taken by surprise, or employees can't claim that they weren't given an opportunity to seek to work from home because they have a condition. So I like to reference the ADA accommodation policy when we're doing a return to office policy or announcement. One other thing to consider, and this isn't so much in the policy, is if you've had employees who have been working remotely for a very long time and this is their first time coming back to the office, it might be a good time to do some training on harassment and discrimination in the workplace. There's going to be a lot more interactions in person, Or it might be a good time to do, some sort of employee engagement activities the first few weeks that they're back in the office, so they can really feel the benefits of that collaboration and mentorship and workplace culture. And that's something you can work with, with your HR team and your training team to come up with some good solutions for that. So what about the announcement? I think this is where employers kind of fall into the trap of maybe not handling it so well, or not giving an explanation. And this is really where you can kind of hit that pushback head on from your employees. You're always going to get pushback when you announce some form of return to office. But we've seen that, explaining the reasons why might be very effective, especially if you're a long-time organization and you can, talk about or remind employees about the good times when we were back in the office and some of the successes we've had because of that. So that can be a helpful story or buy-in to include in the return to office announcement. And especially a focus on the future, what you see for the organization, why being back in the office is going to be beneficial for the employees and the employer as well. It can kind of create this morale drive that can be really effective for employees. You also want to be accessible for questions and concerns because you're going to get many from employees. But I would recommend to remain firm. One thing you don't want to do is start making exceptions without any sort of framework for doing that. Because what's going to end up happening is you're going to have some inconsistent results, and you might find yourself in a disparate treatment claim because some employees are not being expected to return to office, even though it's a requirement, and others are. So I would be mindful of making exceptions and maybe limiting them to when it's required by the law, such as an ADA accommodation, or when you've got a business reason for it, like a department or a particular key talented professional you don't want to lose. And I think it's more effective to deal with those issues on the front end when you're crafting your return to office policy than on the back end when you're just making a ton of exceptions to it. So if there's one department that's very talented and might have a lot of attrition and cause a revenue drop when you do return to office, that might be somebody or some group of employees that you allow to stay hybrid for a while before you give them a full return. You could also considering offering a carrot rather than a stick with your return to office. And what I mean by that is there might be some alternative benefits you can announce alongside your return to office policy. So in other words, the announcement could be, we are requiring employees to return to office 5 days a week, but we're offering an additional 10 paid personal days a year that will be front loaded, every January. And this way employees feel like, there's a silver lining to coming back to the office. Now we've got these personal days we can use, so we've got some flexibility that we can look forward to. You might even, again, like I mentioned earlier, offer remote work as a benefit in the terms of everybody needs to come back to the office. But if we have a really successful year, as a bonus perk, we're going to offer, 15 remote days in the next calendar year, or some other metric that you want to come up with for company-wide or department-wide, or however you want to tailor it. I think that can help soften the blow for a lot of employees and maybe avoid that pushback that you'd otherwise see. There's different approaches to announcing your return to office, and I've listed them here. There's town hall meetings or video announcements. Town hall meetings are nice because you can kind of deal with the concerns in a group setting. Depending on how big your organization is, that might be difficult to do. You might need to kind of push that down to managers for their teams to make it more palatable to have that discussion. You could do the newsletter or email announcement. And you should also encourage your managers to have informal conversation with employees about how return to office is going or what their concerns are. I think it's important for employees to feel heard and listened to, but again, that doesn't mean that you need to walk back your return to office plans. So let's talk about tracking and enforcement. Littler polled about 400 professionals in Q1 of 2024 to see how were they tracking in-person attendance for return to office. And the overwhelming response was through badge swipes, which seems to be a really cost-effective way to monitor in-person attendance, and also pretty low risk from a data privacy standpoint, because there's not really an expectation of privacy when you're getting access to a secured facility. It's kind of like a sign-in sheet or a visitor's log. You expect that the employer is going to maintain a copy and look at that. But badge swipes has disadvantages. The next most common was time clock systems, which is essentially when you're punching in or out for your shift, you're also going to identify where you're working from. And then a lot of employers, or at least 25%, weren't tracking at all. And I think that there's a lot of pros and cons to each of these approaches, and I'll talk about that in more detail, but there is a benefit to tracking compliance with the policy. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper that doesn't have much meaning, and you're going to have a lot of upset employees who don't feel like their colleagues are being held to account when they're not coming in at all and getting paid the same and having the same results. So you do want to do some form of tracking and enforcement. And we'll talk about what methods are probably best for your situation. Unsurprisingly, 1 in 5 workers admit they are not following their return to office policy. It's probably higher than that. Those are just the ones that'll admit it. I think it's probably more like 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. And the picture here is kind of indicative of coffee badging, which is when employees know that they're being tracked by their badge swipes. So they'll badge in, grab a cup of coffee, hang out for an hour, and then leave and work from home. And the employer is none the wiser that they weren't there all day. So this was a recent survey by Resume Builder in September, where they surveyed about 1,000 US-based full-time employees, and 1 out of 5 admitted they were not following the return to office policy. So for tracking and enforcement, performance management for policy violations should be supported by documentation and applied equally to avoid discrimination. If you're going to discipline an employee, particularly if you're going to terminate them because they're not returning to the office consistent with the policy, you should definitely keep documentation proving their failure to come into the office. So that could be badge swipe records, that could be their computer access login, or however else you're monitoring it. But it's good to keep a copy of that, because if you end up in some sort of retaliation or other employment claim where they claim that was a fabricated reason for their termination, you can lean back on that document to prove your basis for letting them go. And it might be that they didn't swipe in for a couple weeks or 3 days or whatever your policy says. So I would definitely keep records of that documentation. And it's also a good idea to do that so that you're consistent in how you're disciplining your employees. You don't want managers running wild and making assumptions about who was here and who wasn't here. If you have a requirement that they have documentation backing it up, it can make it a lot easier for HR to review that termination record before it gets distributed, and to know that there's a basis for this, a legitimate basis for this discipline. Another thing to consider with enforcing your policy is to be cautious and not trigger happy when an employee doesn't show up to work. There can be circumstances where an employee takes emergency sick leave and they don't have time to call in. And if you were to terminate them in that scenario, you could be violating the law. So it's very important to take a step back and see whether there's another reason they're not there, or to give them a couple of days. But I would be careful not to just jump to conclusions of why they're not showing up. Be mindful of sick time in particular. So when you're trying to decide, or you've already implemented electronic monitoring for in-person attendance, there's several things you should be thinking about. And I'll go back to the survey to talk about the pros and cons of each method, but you're going to want to consider how available and accurate the data is. Okay, so if it's something that's maintained by a third party, like geolocation monitoring of a company phone or something else, you may not be able to get it right away when you want to discipline employees or review in office attendance. You should also consider the cost of monitoring. I think badge swipes are really predominant because they're relatively low cost to keep that data and track it in a spreadsheet. And other methods might be more expensive because they might require some IT knowledge to explain the location of the employee. And you can see this sometimes with, if you're monitoring VPN access or network logs, you might be putting more of a burden on your IT team to explain that data to you. You should also consider the collection and storage of this data. Sometimes it can be really costly to keep all this information on your databases or your servers. And so you should think about, what you can afford, what room you have to store data. I think training is extremely important, especially if the data can be something that's not easily understandable by looking at it. Again, if you have a manager who's going to be deciphering these network access logs on computers, you want to make sure that they're trained and they know how to do that. Or there's an IT person that can give them some guidance, because if they're misinterpreting it and the employee actually has been on site, that could be an issue if you discipline the employee. Lastly, you might need to implement separate policies and procedures for data privacy law compliance. There's at least 14 states in the United States that have data privacy laws. There are some cities that have specific ones as well. And you want to be mindful of these laws when you're selecting your employee monitoring method. And a lot of times what this will come down to is a policy about notice. We're requiring return to office 5 days a week. We're going to be monitoring it by badge swipes, and you should expect that information to be included in a performance review or a disciplinary record. Some states like California might require something more specific, like a signed consent. And if you have any questions about data privacy law, please don't hesitate to reach out. And just going back to the methods that employers are using, I'll talk briefly about the pros and cons of each approach. So as I said, badge swipes are really effective, and they're kind of a cheap method compared to the other ones, but they're also not very reliable because a badge swipe only records when the employee is entering the office. It doesn't track how long they're there, what they're doing while they're there, or what time they leave. And this is where the coffee badging phrase comes in, because employees can easily just check in, grab a cup of coffee, and leave. And if you're not monitoring them through other methods, you're none the wiser that they were only there for 30 minutes or so, and then they left to go work from home. So badge swipes may or may not be a good option for your organization. Time clock systems, unless if it's a physical time clock on site, that can be ripe for untruthfulness, because if it's something that employees are clicking on their computer and choosing the location, there could be some dishonesty there. You're relying on the employee to be truthful, and sometimes employees are not. So a time clock system might not be a good approach for you. It might be cost effective though, because it's already built into your Kronos time system and there's no added cost to get that implemented. I would say the same is true for self-reporting. Essentially employees signing off every day that they were in the office, or, signing an attestation at the end of the year that they were there a certain number of days. Again, you're relying on the employee, and that employee may not always be truthful. So be mindful of those two approaches. Computer and Wi-Fi logins are an effective approach. I think they carry some higher data privacy risks. But basically, this means that you're logging the IP address and the VPN network access of the employee. So when an employee comes into the office and they sign onto the computer through the company's Wi-Fi, that is how you will know that they were in the office. And this can be really effective. It can be precise, or can provide a general location. And it can also give you information for how long the employee was in the office. So that might be a more tailored and specific approach. You may have heard of biometrics. This is like fingerprint recording, facial recognition. I think that this method and also the geolocation tracking of a phone, like a cell phone, while an employee is in the workplace or elsewhere, these two methods carry the highest data privacy law risks. There are certain cities and states that have biometric laws, and also, there are facial recognition software programs that are flawed. I mean, there's definitely been cases or allegations that, certain national origin or certain race don't show up well on facial recognition, or the software doesn't recognize that, or has a problem identifying that person. And that's an issue when it comes to discrimination. If it's not, being equally applied and an effective way to track all your employees, you might end up disciplining people who were there, who are our particular race or national origin, and then you're getting into trouble with an employment claim. And then video surveillance, as you can see, this is the least common method we've seen, and I think it's really onerous. You're going to need somebody to review the videos. Depending on how many employees you have, that might just not be feasible. There also may be issues with storage and how long the video is saved on your system. There could be a lot of auto deletion that's happening to kind of keep your costs down, and then you're not going to have access to that information when you need it. So those are some of the pros and cons of tracking and enforcement. So now we'll talk about the legal pitfalls to avoid. Again, our survey from Q1 of 2024 saw that the biggest increase in requests for leaves or accommodation over the past year was employee mental health. And I think this is something that comes up when you announce a return to office. You will see a surge in requests to work from home. Some of them will be because of legitimate disabilities related to anxiety or mental health disorders, or maybe physical impairments that prevent employees from coming to the office. And others will not be legitimate disabilities, but rather employees trying to avoid having to come back to the office. So how many of you have received a request for accommodation to work remotely due to stress or anxiety? I've got an example here. This is a complete hypothetical, but it's something I think I often see when an employer does a return to office, is something along these lines. So you receive a doctor's note from Darcy, one of your employees, and it says that Darcy struggles with in-person work since the proximity of coworkers and having in-person interactions with others are highly stressful to them. Their home office stabilizes them, allowing them to perform their work. Even the commute creates anxiety because of the fear of arriving at work safely. Sometimes your initial reaction to this may be to call BS and deny the accommodation, but that would be a big problem and a big violation on your part. I think no matter your doubts about the request, you should engage in the interactive process. And we'll talk about how to handle this request in the next few slides. So as I just mentioned, the interactive process when you receive a request to work from home related to a medical condition or a disability is really critical. You're going to want to obtain the basic medical facts from the employee, not asking for a diagnosis, but getting into what really is preventing you from coming to work so that we can try to work out a solution for you. What do you need? What are your restrictions? If it's just generalized fears about coming to work safely, maybe we can reassure them with public transit or some other method to get to the office. Why and how long will you need to work from home? Can you tell us some information about the duration of this? Is it indefinite, or is it just a couple days or a couple weeks? Are there any modifications that we could make that would help you perform your job duties on site? How would those help? If work from home is the only modification you believe we can offer, please let us know as well. So one thing to keep in mind is that you as the employer get to choose the effective accommodation. You do not have to go with the particular accommodation the employee requests. So if we go back to Darcy's note, Darcy talks about in-person interactions being stressful and their home office stabilizing them. And so maybe the conversation with Darcy is, we can give you an office with a closed door. that you can use, and we can give you extra breaks if you feel anxious after interacting with your coworkers. We can implement some sort of social distancing for your role. But oftentimes there's going to be a solution that the employer can come up with through the interactive process with the employee that doesn't result in working from home. So you need to have that conversation and explore that. The second step in dealing with this accommodation is to obtain medical information. An employer can ask for documentation or an ADA certification when they receive a request for accommodation if the disability isn't obvious or the restrictions aren't obvious or known. As a matter of course, I think a lot of times employers will say, thank you for letting us know. Can you please have your doctor fill out this ADA certification? And that's a really good step because it will give you more information about the duration of the disability, what the restrictions are, whether there's any alternatives. And a lot of times the doctor will kind of echo what the employee says, but sometimes you'll get some additional information in there that will help you come up with another solution other than working from home. And as I mentioned, you can consider other possible accommodations, and that could be, maybe it's just going to be partial remote work. Maybe Mondays you can work from home, but you're going to need to be here the other 4 days of the week. And if you can't come up with a solution, time off could be an accommodation. If the job functions really do require in-person attendance, that could be an alternative rather than just letting them work from home if that's not feasible for your organization. The third step in deciding the accommodation is really to talk with the managers about the essential function of in-person remote work or in-person work, because if the job can be performed off-site, it's been performed well off-site, you might have a difficult time proving that in-person work is essential. And a lot of times managers or leaders will talk about teamwork, collaboration, creativity, and supervision, but you need to have support for that buzzword and get specific. So for example, it would be better to say, this employee has to supervise 4 on-site employees who are customer facing, and that cannot be effectively done off-site because they're in the field. We get requests from customers to speak to the manager. If the manager's not there, it creates a conflict with customers. So you want to be able to articulate why this in-person work is essential for this position. You also should consider their performance to date. This might give you an argument to limit or deny work from home. If the employee has not been performing well from home, it could be an in-person essential function because they need to be supervised more closely, or their work product needs to be reviewed. You should also consider your retention data. Again, I think it's important, certainly it's important to comply with the law, but there are times where you might be a little more lenient because you have a really talented employee who's performing well, and you can work with their accommodation and offer them remote work. So you should be considerate of all these factors, but again, you should apply them equally to employees. And lastly, you want to document your conversations. You want to document the interactive process, document the decision making and the time of the discussions you've had. This can all support your response to their accommodation request, whether it's granting an alternative accommodation or denying it. You definitely want to have that documentation and back it up in case you face a claim. Another legal pitfall is mandatory bargaining. If you have a unionized workforce that you're returning to the office, you might be obligated to engage in bargaining with them about your return to office policy. This is really going to depend on what your collective bargaining agreement says about this topic or about management rights. There's at least one case in the past year in 2023 involving a college out of Vermont where they did not bargain with the bargaining unit and did return to office. And an employee who was a union employee failed to return and was terminated. The union filed a ULP with the labor board, arguing that they didn't engage in good faith bargaining. It was a mandatory subject, and this employee was unlawfully terminated as a result. And the board sided with the union on that issue. And what's really fascinating about that is that the board required the college to reinstate the employee to remote work and to make them whole for lost earnings and other benefits, and to post a notice on campus about their violation of their bargaining requirements and the NLRA. So be mindful of bargaining units coming back to the office and whether you need to bargain with the union about that topic, or whether you need to go through a certain process in your CBA before terminating a union employee who's not complying with that policy. The National Labor Relations Board has also filed complaints against companies that implement a return to office in close proximity to a union campaign. So there's at least a few NLRB charges pending where they're claiming that companies were using return to office to fend off a union election or to fend off union organizing. So you should be mindful of the timing of your return to office decision in relation to union activity that you're aware of, because you could face a claim for retaliation and you may need to be able to support your decision and the timing of your decision. Next topic we're going to talk about is protected concerted activity. So under the NLRA, Section 7, union and non-union employees have a right to engage in protected concerted activity, which is essentially speaking up about the terms and conditions of employment. And there are limitations to how far employees can go, but sometimes strikes, picketing, protesting, asking for people to sign a petition in opposition to return to work could be a protected concerted activity. So you want to be mindful of disciplining employees who are trying to engage in that collective opposition to your return to office policy. And you want to be sure that any discipline you give is based on a reason other than them just speaking up against this change to the term and condition and location of work. Otherwise, it could be a violation of the NLRA Section 7 rights. The NLRB has filed a claim against at least one company alleging that it retaliated against an employee who organized a walkout in response to return to office. So whether or not that claim has merit, you should be mindful of your disciplinary measures and the reasons for the discipline, that you're not doing it because of an employee engaging in protected concerted activity. Next thing to be aware of is contract or quasi-contract claims. This has been on the rise in the past few years. As some employees are forced to return to office, they will go back to their offer letter or a statement that HR or a manager made promising them the ability to work remotely. And we have defended a few of these claims in court. Sometimes they involve claims of fraud or promissory estoppel because they can't quite fit it into a traditional contract claim. So you should, before you implement your return to office policy, you should kind of evaluate the past representation you've made to employees about their ability to work remotely, as well as any contracts or written employment agreements, so that you can avoid breaching those agreements or figure out what term you need to implement to make a change. Some of you may have managers who've made some pretty overbroad statements about employees' abilities to work remotely. And I would be mindful of that to the extent you could find out what people have said. Oftentimes you'll hear about this as soon as you do your return to office, because those employees will be coming to those managers in an uproar saying they were promised the ability to work remotely. So be wary of these claims. And lastly, we'll talk about compensable travel time. Compensable work time generally does not include the time spent commuting to or from work under the FLSA for non-exempt employees. So for exempt employees, you're paying them a salary. It doesn't really matter about their commuted time because you're getting paid either way. But for your non-exempt employees, generally they don't have to be paid for the time it takes to drive from their house to the office and vice versa. Compensable work time also generally does not include travel from the office to a hotel and vice versa. So if you've got employees coming from out of state to come back to the office and they're commuting from a hotel to the office and back, that's not compensable time. I've cited some opinion letters and some statutes from the Department of Labor that are helpful resources on these topics if you want to get into a little more detail. 2020, we got a real gift from the Department of Labor, an opinion letter that said an employee who chooses to telework for part of the day and work at the office for part of the day is not owed compensation during their midday commute. So if I come to the office to work here, for this presentation, and then I decide, you know what, I want to work from home the rest of the day, and I leave and I drive home, that's my decision, that's my choice, and the time that I take to drive home in the middle of the workday is not compensable. That's at least what this opinion letter says from the Department of Labor. Now, in a hybrid arrangement, non-exempt remote employees might be entitled to compensation in two circumstances. One is if they're required to take overnight trips to return to office, and there's some very specific rules about what that means to take an overnight trip and when they need to be paid for that time. The other scenario is if the non-exempt remote employee is required to return to office on rare occasions and they travel a considerable distance from their home to the office, and usually that's more than 30 miles. Those two scenarios are very fact specific, and it requires a careful review of the employee's circumstances and the law before determining whether there's compensable time. So if you have non-exempt employees falling into those two categories, I would recommend that you consult your counsel or these opinion letters of the law to try to figure out whether they're owed compensation, because it's going to be a more nuanced inquiry. Lastly, I would be wary of nuanced state law. There's some states that haven't adopted the Portal to Portal Act, is what it's called, under the FLSA, and that have different rules about compensable time for non-exempt employees. So you want to be wary of your state law. And lastly, I would be wary of any policies or contracts that you've issued promising to pay for commuting time, because you're probably going to be held to those. So just some concluding remarks to offer you, and thank you for sitting through this, and I hope it's been very helpful for you. The key takeaways for return to office are that you can tailor return to office to best fit your needs, unless there's a one-size-fits-all approach that's best suited for your organization. So I would encourage you to get creative with your return to office. And for those of you that are worried about attrition, this is really where you can talk to your department heads and your managers and figure out where you've got some real talent or some real revenue growth or important positions that you think might go away if they're forced to return to office, and to make an exception for that department or that position. Planning your return to office announcement and policy the right way might limit some pushback, especially if you coincide the announcement with a new benefit offering, like paid personal days off, flex start times, or the ability to work remotely after a certain number of months of employment. Pushback is inevitable, and it's often very severe when you announce return to office. So just know that when you're going into this, you need to be patient, and I think you should be firm in your decision. You should also ensure equal application of your policy. I would be careful to make exceptions at the end. Better off making those exceptions on the front end when you're crafting your policy and you know who might stay or leave because of return to office. And lastly, be mindful of legal obligations to avoid liability in the wake of returning to office that we discussed earlier. And I think, Stephanie, you have another demo to talk about.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much for providing us with such great insights for these employers who are making or optimizing their return to office decisions. I'd like to offer another opportunity to sign up for a demo of the complianceHR Navigator Suite. So if you are interested in learning more, a survey should have popped up on screen. You may, again, have to exit full screen mode to see it. As you saw during today's event, implementing a return to office policy can be a much bigger task than it initially seems. Our solutions, like the Reference Center and PolicySmart, provide you with instant access to updated, legally compliant information sourced from Littler, and policies, templates for employee handbooks, alerts on changes, and so much more. So if you're interested, please select yes on the poll. And again, I will send your contact information to our team of experts. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add before we conclude today's presentation?
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We have some in the chat, and I'll probably be emailing some of you with some follow-up to address those. But again, thank you, and good luck with your return to office plans.
Thank you all for attending today, and we hope you have a great rest of your morning.